All right, let's move on to letter C, talking about prosperity. Prosperity is just a fancy word for making money and having wealth. And a writer, John Kenneth Galbraith, wrote a book called The Affluent Society, which criticized the lack of government aid for the poor. But more than anything, it really kind of pointed out that Americans were driven by wealth and materialism and accumulating all sorts of goods and trying to see who could have the most things. And this book, The Affluent Society, was a bestseller and really kind of showed people what was going on. Now, you might be wondering what the word affluent means. Affluence or affluence is an abundance of wealth, prosperity, and material goods. And Americans showed this in the 1950s. They wanted more things. Families are finally starting to get like 2 cars per family. Some of you guys have like 5 cars in your family are like, oh, 2 cars, that's nothing. But families started to go on vacations. They started to get bigger cars. They started to get homes that had nicer things, pools. They had garages. They had appliances, TVs, stuff that we would all consider pretty basic. They are actually getting more and more of. And John Kenneth Galbraith kind of mentioned this, but was more focused on what was going on in the society, or I'm sorry, the government. But affluence kind of showed the 1950s, and it really kind of pictured what the 1950s were all about: getting more stuff, getting the newest things, having possessions. And it really did come to describe the 1950s era as a whole for America. Americans were living their best life. Their standard of living, meaning like what their expectation of what they think life should be about, was the highest there had ever been in any society, and it continued to grow during the 1950s. People became more focused on materialism. Materialism is the idea of having more stuff. And this is why, it continues today. This is why I like studying the 1950s, because I think it mirrors today a lot. In the 1950s, if your neighbor got a new car, if your neighbor got a new thing at his house, you would want to get it. In high school, a kid would get a new outfit, well, you'd want to get a new outfit. Kid would get a new pair of shoes, you wanted to get a new pair of shoes. And that is all basic materialism. It is the idea of accumulating more stuff that you believe will bring you more joy. And again, that came to personify the 1950s. Let's talk about revival of religion in the 1950s. This is kind of an interesting topic because people turned to religion because of fears of Cold War and the nuclear age. People were really, truly scared that we were going to be blown to smithereens, that we were literally going to be having our faces melted off by atomic bombs and hydrogen bombs. And obviously, it was a real fear because our government was telling us this. It was a real fear because they found spies in our country. And the government was telling us that we needed to pay attention to this. So what did they do? They started sending out all sorts of documentation. We talked about the duck and cover video. They would send all of that stuff out, and people became nervous. And people were thinking, maybe I need to get right with God in case this nuclear age and Cold War actually does take place. This did lead to a lot of good things. The growth of churches in the 1950s was a pretty large size growth. And one of the big things that actually came from the 1950s was youth groups. Youth groups were not around in the 1800s because kids were all just working. But in the 1950s and post that, that's when you actually started to get churches targeting the youth kids and starting to use youth pastors. And they started to do all sorts of activities to get kids into church. Kids had more leisure time, they had more free time. And one of the guys that was part of this was Billy Graham. He was a famous evangelist during the 1950s. And he traveled around. That's him on the left, and that's Dwight Eisenhower on the right. And he counseled a lot of presidents. But he was probably the most famous evangelist during the 1950s. And actually, up until his death, I think he died last year or 2 years ago, something like that. Your parents have probably heard of him, maybe even went to some of his rallies. He would have these massive rallies. Some of these rallies would take place in ginormous football stadiums, talking like 60, 70,000, sometimes almost 100,000 people. would come to hear this guy preach God's word, which is crazy to think about. Nowadays you do have some mega churches, but selling out a football stadium. He was preaching God's word, and people were getting saved, and he had a huge ministry during the 1950s and the subsequent years that followed. He traveled around holding huge church services. As I said before, people would literally travel all over the place. They would travel from here and far to hear this guy preach God's word. And he did make a huge impact on our society. And one of the things that we said that he would do is like evangelist. It's somebody just who preaches the gospel and travels around. This is a picture of one of his rallies in the 1950s. Guys, this is him right there. I don't know if you can see my cursor there. But this is the LA Coliseum. This is a ginormous football stadium. But all of these people are here to listen to this guy preach. He obviously had like people that would sing and that type of thing. But this is a lot of people. Can you imagine being this guy right here with this hat on right here? And you're listening to this guy all the way down there. You could barely see him. This was well before the age of HD screens that they have at like football stadiums nowadays. You would just listen to him. People would travel this far to listen to Billy Graham. Next, let's talk about letter E, the culture of conformity. The word conformity just simply means to, be like other people, and you kind of want to act like, what is expected. And the first group we want to talk about is a nickname that they gave to a group called the Silent Generation. This is a nickname given to the teenagers of the 1950s. Okay, these are people that were born in the 1940s during World War II, and now they're finally becoming teenagers. And the reason they gave them this nickname is they were really one of the first generations to really be targeted exclusively by advertisers. Now think of it like this. If you go on Instagram and you start like looking at different pictures and posts and liking different things, if you go to like the search, what's going to end up happening is you're going to find that they're going to see, oh, this person likes soccer, or this person likes beaches, or this person likes mechanical stuff. And they're going to keep showing you pictures of those things. And what they start to do is they target their audience. On Saturday football, Saturday in the fall, they have football games. Well, their audience that they're targeting for advertising is men. If you're watching like The Bachelor on, I don't even know what night it is, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, I don't know. I've only watched one episode, and that was forever ago, and I thought it was stupid. But the target audience that they're trying to get with their advertising is women. And so there's certain types of things that they're trying to get out there. But this was the first generation that actually looked at teens and said, wow, teens have leisure time and teens have money. And as advertisers, we need to try to get them to spend their money at our locations, at our stores. You might be like, that doesn't have anything to do with Silent Generation. Well, here's why it did. Because these teenagers were told to obey authority, told to conform and look kind of the same and look good and look nice and act nice. And not to speak out and question authority. You just say, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, and the authority is the final say. You guys are like, isn't that what you guys tell us? Well, not necessarily. We ask you to obey God's word. We don't ask you necessarily to conform, but this was a time when if you were a teenager and you wanted to dress differently, it was not accepted. And everybody kind of had a certain look to them. And you just kind of conformed and you acted a certain way. Some of you guys have actually watched a show called Leave It to Beaver from the 1950s. There's also another show called Father Knows Best. And it's kind of interesting when you're watching these shows because the kids do all kind of dress alike and they act alike. And they're supposed to have good morals. And they're supposed to obey their parents. And their parents are always right. You don't really get in arguments with your parents. And, the principal's always right. And this is back in the day when, like, at schools, you could be getting spanked at a school for a punishment. It would never fly today. Back then, it was perfectly acceptable. And so anyway, they were told to obey authority and not speak out. They were driven, these teens though, even though this was happening, they were driven by music. Music still today drives teenagers, and it did back then. They were driven by dancing. I don't know how much dancing kids do, but they would have these things called sock hops. You guys probably think of the 1950s and the poodle skirts with the girls and the guys, and they would just go hang out at these places. They would go hang out at these drive-ins, like these diners, and where the people would come out and they would serve, there's a place in Flushing called the Flushing A. It's kind of like that. And you drive up or like a Sonic, and they would come up and they would give you guys your food, and then the kids would just stand out there, listen to music, and dance. And guys were infatuated with cars. Cars were a big deal. This is back in the day when those guys would race cars for what they called pink slips, which is basically your ownership to the vehicle, your title to the vehicle. And then they were focused on dating, which that really hasn't changed too much with teens. Now you might be like, so teens in the 1920s didn't focus on this stuff? They didn't, because mainly they didn't have the opportunity. By the 1950s, you have the opportunity, and cars gave them the freedom. A lot of people, a lot of authority figures were very upset that the fact that cars were being created and kids were having these cars, and then they could go off and drive all away from their parents and do all sorts of stuff that their parents would never approve of. And that's why the cars were kind of a everybody, when they first started having cars and giving teens cars, were a little bit nervous about what was going on. But kids were focused on dating. Yeah, kids in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, early 1900s didn't focus on dating. They didn't have time. They were working. They were already starting their life. And so this was a new time period for the teenagers. Here's some pictures. This has been like one of those, they used to have dance contests. Literally, you would dance and dance and dance, and whoever could dance the longest would win. And so that was kind of an interesting time period for that. And then you'd also have the classic where they would be sitting by a jukebox, and they would be drinking their shakes and talking to the girls, talking to guys and stuff. Notice this girl's wearing a skirt. Same thing with skirts. Very common. Guys kind of dressed up, hair slicked back. If you guys have ever seen the TV show Happy Days, that's kind of like an ode to the 1950s as well. And this was the silent generation. And again, trying to get the teens to conform. However, you did have a group like this. Notice how these guys are all kind of dressed. These guys are dressed in jeans, black boots. Their hair is kind of slicked in a weird, kind of funky way. They're wearing black leather jackets, probably wearing white t-shirts under here, guys smoking. And this was the rebellious side. This was the side that said, we're not going to conform. We're going to do whatever we want to do, and no one's going to tell us what to do. If you guys have seen the TV show Happy Days, this was Arthur Fonzarelli, or the Fonz. Now, some of you guys have never seen an episode of Happy Days. You're like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Well, ask your parents, they'll know. But these people dressed differently. They wore black leather jackets. They smoked. They swore. They listened to music that people weren't supposed to listen to. And these guys were like the rebellious side. Now, some of you guys have heard or seen the movie Grease. I do not recommend watching that. It's not a very good movie as far as morals go. But the whole plot of the movie and like the Broadway show is you have this group of guys that dress like this and a group of girls who are trying to get their attention, and it shows very cliquish type teenagers acting a certain way and conforming to try to get other people to like them. And it was like this group of girls, this group of guys, and it's basically about high school in the 1950s. But if you've seen that movie, that's what these guys dressed like exactly. All right, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about rebellion a little bit later on, probably tomorrow, and that should be it for today. You guys do have some quizzes coming up, so please make sure you guys check your Google Classroom, and that way you turn that stuff in on time. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. Hope you guys have a good afternoon.